Welcome to the Mike and Doug Show. I'm Doug. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Doug.
Today we're going to celebrate. We are going to put someone into the Hall of Fame of Truth History. And I just want to underscore the fact that all those who are supporting Truth History, thank you very much. And remember, this is Truth History playing out in today's news. This isn't something of the past. But if you don't know the past, you can't possibly be able to conquer the future. So today we're going to basically round off a whole chapter on Lillian Scott Troy and the research that Mike and the miners have been doing. And basically, I just want to say she's a heroine. And we wish to, we're going to give her an official membership to the conclave and to AIMCATS and to the American intelligence media, and just say that from now until forever, she has a place in our hearts, because today you're going to tell us new information about her. Now, we already set the stage. She's the person who came up with the secret 24-step plan for the Pilgrim Society to annex America, to take over America and the whole world. But you've got much more information, and it has now literally become a thriller, an exciting movie script that we could literally tell basically the history of modern world through Lillian Scott Troy. So tell us about some of the new things you found out about her.
Well, as we have shared, when we start investigating these people, other types of information seem to always pop out of a significant nature. And Lillian Scott Troy moved to London in 1908, which was about 6 months before the Imperial press conference occurred on June 5th of 1909. And what we now learn from new information that was just recently received is that in 1941, she wrote about her friendship with none other than W.T. Stead. We had never seen that writing before, and it was buried in a college, George Mason University course on internationalism. And in that course, they documented an article she wrote in the Leader in San Francisco in 1941, which described her friendship with W.T. Stead. And for those of you who don't know, and most people don't, W.T. Stead went down on the Titanic, which was April 15th of 1912. And of course, that was just a fact. We knew that fact. And here we see her friendship with W.T. Stead starting in 1908. So there's a long time in between there, and we never connected the dots that there may be a connection between what Lillian Scott was doing in London and her friendship with W.T. Stead and her activities, her political activities. She was a suffragette. This is a spunky woman. She was, by all accounts, very beautiful, and she was only 5'1". We know that from her passport application. And she took she didn't take second place to any man. She went there. She was sent there by her employer, who was the San Francisco News Company. And they were the main distributor of newspapers and periodicals, over 300 on the West Coast. They were a division of American News Corporation, which had the virtual monopoly on all newspapers and periodicals being distributed in the US. So they would be an organization that newspapers and magazines would want to keep on their good side. So anyway, we see Lillian getting involved in London just before the Imperial press conference. Now, think about it. If you are in the newspaper business and you catch wind that this conference is being organized and 650 of the newspaper people that you have distributed from across the world are going to show up in London, wouldn't you pay attention to that activity? Well, the answer is obviously yes, you would. And then further, we knew that William Randolph Hearst had visited with Stead back in 1899 in New York, and Stead discussed his concepts of government by journalism with William Randolph Hearst. And so we surmise, and it's a reasonable assumption, that Randolph Hearst had something to do with the introduction with W.T. Stead. Now, Hearst was at that time in 1908 preparing to run for mayor of New York. And so what we see here is that Lillian was extremely connected to the newspaper players of the day. And that is kind of a background scenario for what we're going to talk about. Because what we now see is there very well could be a direct connection between the relationship between her and W.T. Stead and the sinking of the Titanic. Now I'm gonna just throw that one out there because that's a mouthful, and I know that it's not going to be it's going to be hard for people to believe that, but we can talk about the details of that and why we believe that may be the case when we actually see that there's been a lot of discussion about the hidden agendas in the sinking of the Titanic. So I'm going to stop there, Douglas, and let you comment.
Well, Lillian is my heroine, because I see her as the antithesis to the most important intelligence meeting of history, which is the Empire Press Conference, which became the Empire Press Union, which became basically all of the British newspapers, and then the Associated Press, Reuters, all basically of what we would call mainstream media, is the result of that meeting. And that, in anyone's mind, was not even a conspiracy because it wasn't even known. The Empire Press Conference wasn't even known. I'm a British historian, and I didn't know it even existed.
Well,
And
it's been obviously suppressed by historians.
but as you say, Lillian, knowing Randolph Hearst and knowing basically the distribution of all the different British papers, saw that the British propaganda system through the media was so effective that when this meeting was called, I'm sure she went over long in advance to make her inroads. And now this is where the part comes in where I'm writing a spy novel. I'm going to speculate that Lillian must have known someone on the inside, not only of the Empire Press Conference and then later the Union, which is basically all media in Britain and anywhere that Britain touched, but also that she somehow penetrated into Cecil Rhodes' group because she got the secret 24-point plan. Now, early on in the game, I imagined that maybe her and W.T. Stead somehow got together and that she was acting as a good journalist, trying to find out the truth of the matter.
Yeah, I'm sure when she first got over there, that was her job. She was just digging.
And whether it was Stead or someone else, obviously she found out what the Empire Press Conference was about. She also found out this secret 24-point plan of how to annex America. In other words, to basically state that the American Revolution was never won.
Douglas, you jumped right into the 24-step plan, but we haven't really given an overview for those who haven't heard about that. So, if you don't mind, let me talk about that. What we know from first, we read it in a congressional record in 1940 from a representative from Montana by the name of Dr. Thorkelson. And in it, he describes that Lillian in 1912, in February of 1912, published a 24-point plan that the Pilgrims Society was using in the annexation of the USA. Now, those are specific phrases that they used. And in this 24-step plan were things like that their plan was to empower the US president and disempower the Senate. And so and now we can see why the logic, there was that logic, and that was so that they could, oh, sorry about that. Their logic was that they could repeat a model of governance in the US that mimicked the British model with the king being on top. So they wanted a powerful president. They did not want an empowered Senate or Congress. Secondly, step number 2 was that they were going to arrange for only chief justices and associate justices in the Supreme Court that were pro-British. And since we now have a Chief Justice who is a member of the Knights of Malta English Priory, I think they've been pretty successful with that. And the next step is that they were going to use their peerages, their titles, Sir, Knight, Duke, whatever, to distribute them strategically to Americans so that they would basically, they said that Americans really love those titles and they were going to use them to their advantage. Now, those are just 3 or 4 steps of the 24 steps. They had specific instructions about how they were going to take over the US military, how they were going to infuse their propaganda throughout the American press. And this was a secret plan. And this was a devastating plan if it were to ever be exposed. And so we now know from a 1941 article that Lillian wrote that she came into the possession of that in 1909. And we also know from the article that when W.T. Stead, who was, by the way, the chief, I'm going to call him a spiritual strategist, but he was the chief strategist for the upcoming Imperial Press Conference in 1909. He begged her not to publish it. And he appealed to her idea that as a young 27-year-old journalist, if she published something like that, it would ruin her career. And she listened to him at that time. She'd only been in London for months. She listened to him and didn't publish it, but she had it. And so the question that you've brought up is who gave it to her? That we don't know, but it had to be somebody on the inside of the British Pilgrim Society that was specifically in charge of getting a copy of this and making sure that they carried this out. So it had to be the people that were around Cecil Rhodes. It could have been W.T. Stead. Again, we don't know. It could have been Lord Northcliffe, who ran the Daily Mail. It could have been Lord Burnham, who ran the Daily Telegraph. It could be any number of key people, but it wasn't that many people who were on the inside of that operation and this plan. And what we do know from the founding documents of the Pilgrim Society, their plan was to carry out Cecil Rhodes's will and testament, where it is well recorded that one of his insistences was if the British Empire was going to reorganize around this corporatist federal model, they had to have America back in the fold in the British Empire. And what we now have is we see that Lillian Scott Troy, by 1912, was investigating Andrew Carnegie quite vociferously. And in her investigation, she discovered that Andrew Carnegie was registered as a citizen and a voter in Scotland. And he was also registered as a voter in Manhattan. So she published that widely. It is widely, we see many of the newspapers. By the way, this coverage involved the hundreds of American newspapers. We're still reviewing newspapers where Lillian's articles have been written. But in those articles, she started investigating why he had this dual citizenship, and she was advocating that he be disempowered from his voting opportunity in the United States, because it was well known Carnegie was an Anglophile. He was in favor of the reuniting of the British Empire with America, and actually the other way around, the reuniting of America with the British Empire, and that he was using his funds to make that happen. And that one of his key concepts was everything I do, you're going to put peace in the name. The Peace Society, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. That was the organization that sponsored the 1993 conference that enabled the FBI to get a backdoor encryption key to all internet transactions, by the way. But I digress. So Carnegie had specific ideas about how that was going to happen. And what Lillian found out was that in 1902, the new King Edward VII went to Skibo Castle up in Scotland, visited with Carnegie and offered him a dukedom if he would arrange for the annexation of the USA back into the British Empire. That's well published. And it was obviously news all over the world. And so here we have the new king of England, who was the honorary chairman of the British Pilgrim Society, asking Carnegie to use his influence to basically wipe out the American Republic and put it back in the British Empire. I mean, it's scandalous when you think about it now, but and it was scandalous back then. But isn't it interesting how nobody's aware of that this happened?
Well, it's fascinating because Cecil Rhodes made his first benefactor of his will, W.T. Stead. I used to think that he was the executor, but you pointed out that he was actually the benefactor. So here's Stead coming up with all these cosmic.
By the way, there were two benefactors. One was Stead named, and the other was Mr. X.
Oh,
That's actually in the documents. Now we think that was Lord Rothschild, but go ahead.
this is going to be a good murder mystery, I'm telling you. And so what we can see here very obviously is that William T. Stead knew what the 24-point plan was. And in the Society of the Friends, or the, what was it called?
The elect.
The elect, Society of the Elect, and then their friends, the supporters. John Jacob Astor was one of them. And so you have to ask the question, if someone took the 24 secret points and made them public, I think their life would be in danger. Now, who would have known? Well, we know W.T. Stead would have known that, and we know that some of the friends of the supporters of the Society of the Elect, or Cecil Rhodes's Round Table.
Well, at that time, it was the Pilgrim Society. Those two were earlier iterations, exactly. But the ultimate objective of the Society of the Elect and the Round Table was the formation of the Pilgrim Society. Let's get that sequence right.
Yeah, exactly. And then later came Chatham House and
right.
And all,
those
all
came out of the Pilgrims,
the RRIA and the CFR and all that. So the point is that I think they would have been mad at anybody who revealed that secret. And there were only a few people who knew the secret. And certainly, if you did a crosswalk with who was a member of Cecil Rhodes' inner groups and who was in the Empire Press Union or the conference, you're going to find John Jacob Astor and William T. Stead would be two likely candidates. Later, first off, we know that Carnegie, basically through like his fake International Peace Fund and basically his fake gifts to America to create libraries in every city in America, well, that was to control the books that would be read and the newspapers that would be, that's what people went to read. They didn't have books. Libraries were basically the source of spreading intelligence, second only to newspapers. And whatever was in newspapers or whatever was in a book was believed in those days to be the truth, which of course is, we now know, the opposite.
So no, it's not. We can see it now.
And so you have Carnegie taking over basically one side of the intelligence, J.P. Morgan buying the editorial rights to most of the newspapers as well as the newspapers themselves. And so you have Morgan and Carnegie working directly for the Brits to basically completely control the propaganda of America and rule America through journalism.
So, with the specific objective to paint Britain in a favorable light, because they didn't like the histories that had been written where American revolutionaries were they disparaged the British Empire and the monarchy, and they wanted to wipe that out of Americans' idea so that we would be favorable to a reunion of the two peoples.
And if we thought that we were being exploited, like South America was exploited by the Brits, particularly Cecil Rhodes and later Alfred Milner, who I believe is the one who probably ordered the murder of everyone that they targeted on the Titanic, and we can go into that in a minute. That was J.P. Morgan, who owned those three ships, which were exact copies of each other. And as soon as you say that, people are going to say, well, that's a conspiracy theory. That is nonsense. No, we have the video proof that you can watch, which we're attaching in the dialogue.
Yeah, we can see the propagandists attacking that idea. They used the term debunked. They used the term conspiracy theory, and there's one other term they used a lot, and they still do. I mean, there have been huge attempts to deceive the public as to what really went on with the Titanic.
And you've underscored the fact that Marconi and the theft of Tesla's wireless became the big issue here.
Right.
Because if there was wireless, then maybe you could be saved from running into an iceberg like the Titanic. And so
Right.
wireless became the hero of the day, the hero of the sinking of the Titanic, and it was sunk. But when you hear the whole story, no one can watch the video history and come out believing the Titanic hit an iceberg and sunk accidentally.
Correct. We include in our new article, we include a very detailed video that discusses the Titanic and the J.P. Morgan switching of the Titanic with the Olympia, and the implications of that, and then the British slapping state secrets on the surviving crew members so that they wouldn't talk about what they knew. And when we look in hindsight on what went on there, it's pretty easy to see that the Titanic was just a story. It was like a false flag. It was a 9/11 event. And it was one of their first 9/11 events where they were trying out their new powers of propaganda from the 1909 press conference. This was 1912. So this was only 3 years after the conference. And I've got a lot more to say on that, but go ahead.
Let's because I drifted off there, and we need to address that in a comprehensive way so people can understand. But it's part of my murder mystery here. If Lillian was connected to John Jacob Astor or W.T. Stead, and they got on the Titanic, and of course J.P. Morgan, who was scheduled and booked to be on that passage to America, he got off, and so did a bunch of the other people who were part of his group. But
the day before,
they didn't tell Stead to get off. They didn't tell John Jacob Astor, one of the richest men around, though they were supposed to be part of the inner group. Because why? Someone had betrayed their group,
right,
and given to Lillian Scott Troy the facts. And the facts,
just 3 months earlier.
And the facts are so obvious. If you read this list of 24, you'll say, well, that's still going on to this very day. Right. Americans fall over themselves trying to get knighted by the Queen. Why? It is illegal to hold a British aristocratic office and be an American. And as a matter of fact, as far as I'm concerned, there shouldn't be dual citizenship for anyone, especially for Brits and Americans. And most of the Russian oligarchs are first British and then they become American. And now we have Putin saying that the world is ruled by golden billionaires. This is the same exact people that we're talking about. This is the Pilgrim Society. And remember, right, he's one of them. Remember, everything in Russia that made his dictatorial rulership possible came from Britain, incubated in Britain. The isms that ruled, the communism, the Bolshevism, all that's British. And to think that he is separate. But when the Brits recently declared war on Putin, though they're not even involved in the war and have no stake in the war, have no treaties, nothing, no agreements, nothing, they declared full mobilization against Putin. Well, this is the same exact battle. And people are saying—
You mean the Titanic story?
Yes. It's
so they're fighting amongst themselves.
Yeah, Putin is doing the same thing Lillian Scott Troy did.
Okay, so I know you believe that. I'm not sure I do, but that's just for the record. I don't know yet what I believe about Putin, who may have frisked me at the Leningrad border years ago. But if we can get back to the timing here, because the timing here is what makes this story intriguing. So Lillian in 1909 went along with W.T. Stead. She did not publish the 24 points, but she obviously knew them. And so what she started doing was investigating J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie. And then she found these lies that Andrew Carnegie was telling and then published those. And then for whatever her reasons are, we don't know yet, in 1912, in February, she published those 24 steps in the San Francisco Leader newspaper, which was an Irish Catholic newspaper, we believe, owned by Hearst. Randolph Hearst, who, by the way, I don't think was a part of the Pilgrim Society. I think he was skeptical of the this British plan. But they published those. That was in April, and then the Titanic went down on. No, that was in February, and then in April, on April 15th, the Titanic went down. Well, this investigative journalism that we've included makes a very compelling argument that J.P. Morgan had these twin ships, and that the first ship was the Olympia, and they put a reckless captain in charge of the Olympia who wrecked it 2 or 3 times, and it basically made it uninsurable, and J.P. Morgan was going to lose his investment, and there were 30,000 Belfast shipyard workers that potentially would lose their employment if he didn't do something to deal with the fact that the Olympia was a limping financial disaster. And so the bottom line of this investigation is that he switched the ships that were identical, and that what the ship that actually went down was called the Titanic, but was actually the Olympia. And so here we have W.T. Stead, 3 months after that publishing of the 24 Steps, is put on that ship along with John Jacob Astor. And apparently there were about 100 business competitors of J.P. Morgan and the Rothschilds and the Warburgs who were on that ship, who all went down. Now, the other odd thing about the Titanic story is the accurate part of the DiCaprio movie is that they saved mostly women and children, and the men stayed on the ship and very nobly went down with the ship. That was the story. What we suggest is that that's not exactly what happened, and the reason they didn't have enough lifeboats was to make sure that the men stayed on, and so they could take out all of these business competitors of J.P. Morgan and the Rothschilds and this British conspiracy with its 24-point plan of the Pilgrim Society that had just been published. Was probably all the talk of the people that were on that boat. I mean, I'm sure it would have been. And so J.P. Morgan probably had to pretend that he was going to get on that ship, otherwise others would doubt their safety. In fact, there was talk that it wasn't a safe ship. So what we see is the possibility, and I think it's very strong, that they were murdered, that they were taken out, they were probably hauled into certain rooms, maybe shot, thrown overboard, whatever. Now you think, well, nobody would really do that. You mentioned in just a minute ago that Alfred Milner, the butcher of the Transvaal, was one of the co-founders of the Pilgrim Society. And this is the man, along with Lord General Roberts, who was the first president of the British Pilgrim Society in 1902. He was the Milner's chief general in the Second Boer War, and those two men together killed at least 60,000 people, blacks and whites, in the first modern British concentration camp, a camp that even Adolf Hitler modeled on. So the Boer War, the Second Boer War, the atrocities of the concentration camp killed over 60,000 people. We know that because there is extensive parliamentary record in England where different representatives or MPs are trying to get information about that, and the British government stonewalls them all. And so when we realized that Milner and Roberts were the people in charge of the Pilgrim Society, then you see that losing 1,000, 2,000 people in the Titanic would be another day at the office for these people. So they didn't care, just like they didn't care at 9/11. The same group of people in their later bloodline iterations didn't care that a couple of thousand Americans died on 9/11, nor did they care that they killed millions in World War I or World War II or Vietnam or Korea. All of those were sacrificial lambs on this altar of creating a one world government run out of London. That was their objective. and they had to get America back in the fold. And part of the thing they had to do was shut up W.T. Stead because he knew too much. He was there when Cecil Rhodes, in fact, there is strong evidence from his diaries that he was the man who came up with the name Society of the Elect in 1888. I think he did come up with it. And then he was the one that conceived about this secret society that Cecil Rhodes dreamed of. But the problem is he was more eclectic than these average bankers, these dullard bankers, and these warmongering generals. He had a lot broader interest, and I think over time that they didn't like that, and so I think they finally got rid of him in the Titanic. That was one of the agendas of that wreck.
Yeah, I don't think he quite had the ruthlessness of Alfred Milner. And Milner didn't want any of the pie in the sky kind of spiritual, psychic, whatever stuff that
Right.
Stead was involved with the Julia seances and all this stuff.
Julia's Bureau.
Julia's Bureau and the Psychical Research Foundation he was basically leading the whole paranormal psychological studies in Britain, and so he was definitely a strange dude. And I don't think he had the ruthlessness that it took
Right.
that an Alfred Milner did in Transvaal. And we remember that Winston Churchill was his made reporter, and that what they found in the Transvaal and what Alfred Milner, you hear him complaining about all the time, is why aren't the British supporting us? We need to have stronger propaganda. And so Winston Churchill went down there and faked that he was captured and escaped from his captors.
They always have a
Complete
little story
nonsense.
like that.
Complete, absolute nonsense. No, this was the ability to find out what you've pointed out. How big of a lie can we tell and get away with it? And
Right.
Transvaal showed as big as you want, any lie you want. The Titanic, I just want to underscore something. People think that even what you've just said is nonsense. No, wrong. Here's what happened. J.P. Morgan, in my opinion, knew the war was coming. He built the three largest troop carriers, which were basically, can carry people for transatlantic. Well, there was no need for three giant, exactly same copy. They're all the three same ships. What was that about? That was to carry troops. I believe J.P. Morgan knew that the war was going to come and that he was going to be carrying troops from America to support the British. This was part of the Pilgrims' plan. There had to be able to get our army and our resources to and from America very quickly. And so J.P. Morgan, when the third ship was called Britannica, one or the other, and basically it was the same that the British always do. They create a company like what's a word mark? Smartmatic. They create Smartmatic, then Smartmatic LLC, then Smartmatic PLC, and then they have all from the beginning. They plan it.
You're thinking Investec. He has over 250 companies that have Investec in their key name. They just keep using the same name over and over again.
BlackRock does the same thing. How many BlackRocks are there? I don't even know. I can't count them all. So that's the point. So they had these three ships from the beginning. Now, that demonstrated to me that the Pilgrim Society knew from the beginning that they were going to create a clash of nations, basically warring factions. And now we don't have to use those anymore. Kissinger's idea, who of course has been knighted, Henry Kissinger, who is one of the biggest traitors to America and to humanity as a whole. Basically, the clash of nations no longer exists. It's now migrant invasions.
Before you go there, can I go back to your previous point?
Yes.
Because you talk about that they knew that this conflict was going to occur. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think that another agenda of the Titanic crash was the promotion of wireless radio. Because at that time, wireless radio was just beginning to be implemented. And one of the things we need to know is that all of the contracts that were being created for Marconi Wireless were handled by Charles F.G. Masterman, who was a nephew of Winston Churchill. And we have scads of parliamentary records on this subject. And so he was introducing the contract to create this monopoly that would be run by the British Home Office and the British Post Office and the Admiralty. So Post Office for inside Britain, the Admiralty for everywhere else in the world. So he was creating those, and those contracts were in process, and they were largely secret. There were some, but back then, getting copies of the parliamentary records was published in the papers, but sometimes hard to follow. But anyway, he was involved with that at the same time that they were feeding all of Tesla's patents to Marconi. Marconi is a total cardboard cutout. Always was, because the British knew that in their new empire, they had to control communication of all kinds. They had control of the cables, and now they wanted control of wireless. But that was just happening at the time of the Titanic disaster. That's the key thing to know here. They had not implemented it throughout the empire. They had not implemented it on all of their shipping all over the world. So we had our researchers pull the newspapers of the day on the day after the Titanic sinking. And what we see now is a completely fabricated story. We see in the New York Herald 6 pages of exquisite detail about every aspect of the sinking of the Titanic. We see very complete lists of who was on, who survived, who didn't survive. And of those who didn't survive, we see these very detailed biographies that would normally take weeks and months to develop. They were already ready. They had full illustrations of the whole North Atlantic globe, where you could see the locations of the various ships, and they had their story all worked out. And so they had their story all worked out on why the people weren't saved. Well, they didn't have total control of all the newspapers in the country, because there were newspapers that said that everybody was saved in various ships. But I don't want to go there right now. So let's stay with wireless. So what we see is all of these exquisitely presented illustrations and photographs of all these. W.T. Stead is listed on there. His photograph was on this newspaper article. And as we now know is a technique of the propagandists, they always have these exquisite emotion-laden details about who gave up his post so that some woman and child could get on the boat and would be saved, and this person would go down. There's even stories of Astor and W.T. Stead practically holding hands on their way down. I mean, it's just unbelievable, Douglas. I mean, it's just disgusting to read it now, but at the time, I'm sure everybody thought, wow, how'd they get all this? Well, they would have assumed they got all this from the Marconi wireless, which was still doing Morse code. But that's a detail that would have been lost. Remember the tragedy of 9/11, how we were just shocked and we believed everything that was being told us, and now we know most of it was a lie. Well, back then, they were promoting the idea that the British Empire was going to mandate that the wireless capabilities of Marconi, after they organized the entire paperwork on all the companies to make sure they had their monopoly, they were going to push the idea forward that all ships all over the world had to implement Marconi wireless. Now, we went through and actually read all the articles in this New York Herald paper on the 6 pages, and Marconi wireless was mentioned 30 times in these articles. So that's a tell. They were pushing the agenda. Now, within 3 months, I think it was, the British Parliament passed a law mandating that Marconi wireless be implemented across the globe. So there you have it. This was all a part of the plan to take control of communications. Now, I'm going to talk another false flag, because everybody knows about this one, and that is, after we invented social networking, a movie came out, I think it was 2005. It was the Social Network, and it was this fake story of Zuckerberg this idiot savant boy genius who over a weekend with a couple weeks with drinking beer and chasing women came up with social networking. That was the story that was pushed out. Well, there's another example of how a total lie was pushed out all over the planet through Hollywood and newspapers. And to this day, that's what most people think happened. So yeah, we'll believe the lies that they push forward. They've known this, and the Titanic was one of their first big tests of this. That's where I went with this.
The Titanic / Olympia had behind it one of the triplet ships, what was the real Titanic, following right behind it. I didn't know that till your miners found that out. That explains a lot, because in the cargo holds of the one that was called Titanic that was sunk was
That was the Olympia.
which was the Olympia, was incredibly valuable stuff, incredibly valuable cars, amazing diamonds, some of the largest cut diamonds in the world, Egyptian mummies, statuary that belonged to J.P. Morgan. He put everything of value on the maiden voyage of a ship that they said was unsinkable. But if you got on it, everyone noticed it tilted to the left, what they call list to the starboard, I think they called
Port,
it.
list to port.
List to port. And basically everyone who got on it said, this ship is leaning to the left. Why? Because the starboard had been banged into twice, had been repaired. You could see the repairs on the ship on the maiden voyage. You can actually see the repairs over that area. That was the area that ran into the iceberg, not the front of the ship. They had to hit that same area. They all also had a fire going, which they kept stoked for a long time, and then they didn't close the safety doors so that
that was in one of the coal bins. There was this secret fire going that they hid from the inspectors before the ship left.
The captain told the people watching for icebergs at the front of the ship to stop. He put the co-pilot in charge. He couldn't be found, even when they called for him, saying that there was danger. He also said it had to go full blast, full tilt, the whole time, so that they could meet in this exact spot in the deepest part of the Atlantic Ocean. So when it went down, no one would try to recover it.
2 miles down. It sank 2 miles down. That was in the detail on the next day.
Now, this is absurd, but it underscores exactly what you just pointed out. It's how big of a lie can you tell? How good is your propaganda machine that can cover it up? I want to go back to Randolph Hearst. Randolph Hearst and Pulitzer in New York had a battle. It was called the Battle of Yellow Journalism. Why was there a battle of yellow journalism? Because the one told the other, I can create a war that I can get people to sign up for and go fight for that doesn't even exist. There won't be one shot ever fired. And I will have all of America believing that we're in a war. And he did so. Pulitzer did the same thing. They created what was then known as yellow journalism, literally on yellow pages with these strange pictures and stuff, because they found that went right into the person and it was more effective as propaganda. And so they had a battle. And so when you get the Pulitzer Prize, or when you get the Nobel Peace Prize, you're being given a prize for the opposite of what that person who's giving the money did. Pulitzer was a liar. He was the worst liar, along with Randolph Hearst, along with the British propaganda that you could ever imagine.
You'd have to add Stead into that, because he's often called the father of tabloid journalism in England.
Absolutely. And we don't care what is in the article. We only care about the headlines, and they knew this. And so what we see here is the perfect example. No one knows that there were triplet ships built by J.P. Morgan for the carrying troops to World War I before World War I was ever declared. But we know that it's true because Lillian Scott Troy's cohort, von Horst, was locked up and kept in prison for the entire World War I because he knew the plan, because he got the information that Lillian Scott Troy got. And the cutting of the cable, of the German cable, was actually the beginning of the war. The second that you cut off Germany.
That was in 1914.
And you
couldn't, in August.
And Germany couldn't tell what was really happening in Germany to the rest of the world now, could they? And the British controlled wireless on the sea. And so therefore there was no secret. There were no secrets. There were no, secret codes that they were using.
Ciphers.
There were no ciphers. Those were all known long in advance by the Rothschilds. Now, remember, when you say Carnegie, when you say Cecil Rhodes, when you say J.P. Morgan,
Or
you say
Rockefeller, add Rockefeller into
and
that group.
Rockefeller, you say, or Warburg, or Schiff, or Morgan, or Peabody, you say British bankers
Right.
/ Rothschilds, Montefiore, Baring. You say the evil British bankers who are still in control of the world today. So this may seem like a page out of truth history, but it's truth history that is still apropos. It's still appropriate for today. And tell them about von Horst. That's what the British do to anyone who tries to tell the truth in their environment. They deported Lillian Scott Troy and they locked up her partner von Horst.
In 1919, they finally deported her, and that was big news in the U.S. By the way, we're just now reviewing that. There's hundreds of news articles about her, and a lot of them carry her picture. So she she was well known, and in fact, the British identified her as one of the most prominent Americans ever to be deported at that time. So we're not talking about just a bit player. So in 1914, Lillian knew his name was Louis von Baron von Horst, and he was a German American who was living in England, and he was in the hops business in San Francisco. And he also had several other businesses. Somehow she got involved in the business side of that, and that was one of the ways she supported herself with her activity, which included being a very active suffragette. She was working with both American and British suffragettes to get the vote. She was also an Irish Republican. She was very much in favor of freedom of Ireland from colonial Britain. And she made she didn't hide that. And her parents were both Irish. They were naturalized American citizens. And so what we see she was very active. She was very vocal. She wasn't afraid, and she used the newspapers to her advantage. And that's probably because of her employer. And so whatever she did immediately got the world press. I mean, if you look at what she did back then, you would be amazed today to be that effective. And she was effective. And so what we see is in 1914, she had used von Horst as a reference when she got her original visa in 1908. We know that from the visa records. And she worked with von Horst, and von Horst was also involved with setting up cinemas all over England and was funding those. And eventually Lillian invested in one, raised money and invested in it, a cinema in Croydon, which is southern part of London, and was involved with. So when he went into prison, they put him in basically it was a concentration camp in London, and he was there the entire length of the war, and they accused him of being a German spy. Well, how can you be a German spy when you're sitting in a British concentration camp, I ask you? But that seems to be lost on a lot of this coverage, because we now see, we're looking at right now newspapers from 1919 after she got back to the U.S. She continued speaking out about the mistreatment of von Horst and her issues with the Pilgrim Society, and to the point where British newspapers from around the globe, colonial papers in New Zealand, in London, in Australia, were trashing her. There was this newspaper called John Bull, and it was a well-known propaganda rag for the British government, and they are disparaging her, trying to say that she was a German spy, but they could never prove it, and that she was colluded with von Horst, who hatched this. Get this, they hatched a plan, a plot to fund cinemas all over Britain and push pro-German propaganda through the cinemas. That was the accusation. So what the British are basically saying is, you're not going to have any propaganda in our newspapers or in cinemas except ours. and so they had to attack von Horst to shut down his operation, which they did. They confiscated all of his property, all of his wealth, and by the way, he lost use of both of his legs while he was in prison and had to be carried around by another person. And Lillian, to her credit, never stopped advocating for him and for his release. And I mean, this woman was impressive. I mean, she's got to be one of the most effective early patriots to attack the Pilgrim Society and expose what they're up to. To this day, they're still up to it.
She's our heroine of anti-pilgrimism.
Correct.
And she, one of the things is the suffragettes who demonstrated got locked up, and she provided tens of thousands of meals for their children while those suffragette were locked up.
According to the papers, 98,000 meals she provided to their children.
She a truly amazing person. So she, as I said, I want to raise a toast to Lillian Scott Troy, and she is now a heroine of and a true official member of the conclave and the AIM-CATS, because she was the good anti-pilgrim. Now let's talk about the bad anti-pilgrim. He's anti-pilgrim. He ran for president. He ran for, governor of New York. He created yellow journalism. He basically became the ruler, the American-owned ruler of the newspapers that were, in fact, trying to stand against, in some certain ways, what the British were trying to do. So he was not truly anti-British. He just wanted to be in control himself.
You're talking about Randolph Hearst,
who then...
By the way, he also ran for New York mayor. He was running for mayor during the 1909 press conference.
And later, he built Hearst Castle. It's actually a complex out there in California that is amazing. And he basically came to rule Hollywood. And so I'm trying to underscore the other thing you just said. The War Propaganda Board realized that it wasn't just newspapers and wireless they needed control of. They needed control of movies, because movies totally hypnotize you, and through auto-suggestion, you believe them whether you want to or not. Sorry, that's the reality, because the way that the lights flicker. So he started controlling Hollywood, basically.
Since you mentioned that, in 1919, when they were breaking up the war propaganda operation within the War Cabinet, one of the things they did was very intentionally took all of their cinematic propaganda activities and moved them to Spain. And this is all recorded in the recently released documents within the British Archives. And then that became the genesis for moving the operation to Hollywood.
Well, and don't forget that then Spain became, under Franco, a fascist. Italy became fascist. Germany became fascist. The communists were fascist. The Chinese communists were fascist. These are all birthed in London, in the incubation system of London, where they used Lord Balfour and many other lords to basically have H.G. Wells, Huxley, and others write predictive programming. So
Arthur Conan Doyle.
Yes. 1984, Brave New World, that was to tell us what it's going to be, to get us used to it. It's the same thing that movies are. Movies are a cartoonization. They're a gross misrepresentation of things on the screen that are so effective at making you believe it that when you're done, you believe it. And that is before 1969, when they started adding silent subliminal control mechanisms, which are now in everything, whether it's an advertisement on your phone, television, radio, it doesn't matter. You're being programmed left and right. And Lillian Scott Troy was standing up against this and basically saying, we need the truth, and we need to show who the most evil group in the world is. And it is no longer the Vatican. It's no longer the Jesuits. It's no longer the Catholic Knights of Malta. It is the British appointed Pope. Remember, the Queen is a German spy. She is not British. She is not Anglican. She's not Saxon. She is German. And the House of Windsor is a fake house, and the Germans took over Britain because why? Britain is nothing more than the result of tribal wars, and the strongest survive. This is social Darwinism, and it doesn't matter whether you're a Jew, whether you're German, whether you're Italian or French or doesn't matter. Fascism is fascism all over the world. And if you're going to be a fascist dictator, well, basically, you just simply follow the British model. And what is that model? That's King Henry VIII created his own church so he could do what he wanted. And basically, the entire British history is nothing more than a continuing, what would you call it, careless wars created by the whims of monarchies. We need to end all monarchies, and we need to end religions that try to enter into the realm of the social, because then they are theocratic and they're political. So we don't need to take any political advice from anyone religious, and we don't need to take our governmental directions from journalism. And as a matter of fact, I am glad that we've come to the point that the majority of Americans, I think the last I saw, 85% of Americans believe that nothing is true in the media. Nothing. That's where we've come to. And Lillian Scott Troy was the perfect example of that. And as soon as we then realize what the mission of this propaganda of the journalists are all about in mainstream media, it will point at the Pilgrims. And then you need to go to Truth History and look up the chapters on who are the Pilgrims, who are they in America, what is Serco, what are the Crown Agents, and how is it that they control our lives to this very moment. And once that is done, all we need to do is get rid of our British modeled federal government by states' rights, simply demanding what's in the Constitution. There need to be no federal courts in any state ever. Federal courts should only exist in the Washington, D.C., period. There should be no lifetime appointments of a judge ever. Any judgment of a judge should be able to impeach them if they have gone against the Constitution. So a judge needs
you can't even attack our judges for fraud. The only thing you can do is impeach them, which almost never happens.
And basically, anyone in the Senate and the Congress who've been in there since 2008 that has voted for the all hazards and pandemic laws, well, they're traitors, and they need to meet the repercussions of being a traitor to America. And Lillian Scott Troy's group was called the Benedict Arnold Group because she believed that these people...
Well, that was an article of hers. It wasn't a group she had.
Right.
She wrote an article called the Benedict Arnold Society, and that was how she exposed the Pilgrims.
And that's what I was going to point out, is that the Pilgrims are traitors. Carnegie's a traitor, Morgan's a traitor, Rockefeller's a traitor, Warburg's a traitor. All of those bankers, they're all traitors. And every single, Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr, they're all traitors. John Carter, they're all traitors. And they should be treated as such. And that's what she was saying. And she's absolutely right. And that's the reason that she is my new heroine, who is the anti-pilgrim person who is showing us that she put her life on the line and spent her whole life fighting these things. And it's not coincidental that you have a great admiration for this woman, and that she printed the first article that revealed this secret in a paper called Leader, like Leader Technologies. Isn't that a coincidence? And who ever heard of Lillian Scott Troy? When you asked me if I ever heard of Lillian Scott Troy,
well, the crazy thing is, Douglas, now we're looking back through all newspapers, and there are literally hundreds of newspaper articles about her in the 1912 to 1920 timeframe. So how is it that somebody who was so prominent back then has been so written out of history? Well, we now know it's because she was telling the truth, and the truth tellers in the British Pilgrim Society didn't want that truth out. And so they have successfully edited her stuff, blocked her stuff for over 100 years. So what we feel like is that we are finally giving her due and we are believing that she may be the first general in the modern information war. That's what it's looking like. I'm not being metaphorical here. She may be the very first one, because she was there when the 1909 Imperial Press Conference was underway. We don't know what she was doing behind the scenes, but she was obviously doing something. And so we owe her a great debt of gratitude.
She is the first field marshal of anti-pilgrimism that has pointed out that Britain, the nation, the United Kingdom, are terrorists. So I'm
And
raising a
by the way,
toast
we're not talking about the English. We're talking about the British.
to Lillian Scott Troy.
Cheers.
Hip hip.
May her memory be eternal.